Hello, class, and welcome to Forensic Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and this week we are going to be covering trauma and victimology. So, as always, I want to tell a little story about a key person, and then we'll dive into a little bit of victimology and what victimology is and how it helps with our investigations within forensic psychology. And then we'll be taking a look at different types of trauma, including rape and sexual assault, and how to deal with that. And then into trauma and prevention of post-traumatic stress disorder, because one of the most important things that we want to do with trauma is to lessen its impact as much as possible within a person's life. So let's dive into our little story. And our story for today is about a researcher by the name of Joseph Zohar. Born in 1948, he was, at the time of my last research on him, the director of psychiatry and the anxiety and obsessive compulsive clinic at the Sheba Medical Center in Israel, and also professor of psychiatry at Tel Aviv University in Israel. He's also a founder of the World Council on Anxiety, as well as the Israeli Consortium on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And what we will be doing in this research is looking at how he pioneered research in helping to prevent PTSD. Not avoiding the actual event, but avoiding the psychological impact of the event within the victim. He is currently leads the chief installation of the Israeli Defense Force for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, and has been a long time member of the executive committee of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, which is where I've met him. And just diving in a little bit. So this is somebody that you will want to, if you're ever doing any research on post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders in general, or anything to do with trauma, you'll want to look at Zohar's research and see what the latest is within that field. As far as victimology goes, victimology really is the scientific study of victims. It's focusing on their experiences, the impact of crime on them, and their interactions with the criminal justice system. So it examines a lot of different areas, from psychological impact to the social and legal aspects of being a victim. And the field itself encompasses a wide range of topics, including the causes and consequences of victimization, the relationship between victims and offenders, and the societal response to victims. And traditionally, victims have been overlooked in the study of crime, with the focus being primarily, obviously, on the offender. And victims are sometimes even blamed for their victimization. That whole concept we hear of victim blaming. And sometimes there's a misunderstanding where when someone is researching into the victim, people perceive it as victim blaming when it's not. It is instead an important tool of an investigator to look into the life of the victim in order to understand the thinking and the MO of the perpetrator. Now, the emergence of victimology really kind of came about in the 1940s and 50s as a very distinct field, and pioneers like Benjamin Mendelsohn and Hans von Hentig began to explore the role of victims in the criminal process. And this led to their recognition that victims are central figures in really understanding crime, because without the victim, is there a crime? And so it's important to have them as part of the picture. And so modern victimology really recognizes that there is a critical area of study within criminology and forensic psychology that needs to consider the victim, the victim's rights, the support services for the victim, and the psychological impact of the crime. Because crime is not even primarily oftentimes financial, but is psychological. It's the harm done to the people. And so there are some key concepts that we need to kind of keep in mind here. First of all, the whole idea of victimization is that very broad process of being harmed, of suffering from a criminal act. And so victimization can be direct, where you receive immediate harm caused by the crime, or indirect, where you receive the broader impact of the crime on, say, for example, the victim's family or the community. There's also secondary victimization, and that really kind of refers to the additional trauma that victims may experience through their interaction with the criminal justice system or society. And so it's important to not have insensitive questioning by law enforcement or media scrutiny, because that becomes then secondary victimization. And there can also be victim-offender overlap, and there's that recognition that some individuals may be both victims and offenders, which really complicates that whole traditional victim-offender dichotomy. And so we need to recognize that there is an important role for victimology in the criminal justice system. So, because victimology plays a crucial role in the development of things like victim rights legislation and advocacy. And so we're ensuring that victims have a voice in the criminal justice system. There needs to also, it recognizes that there needs to be research in victimology that helps to inform policies on victim compensation and protection and support services. And it also influences how law enforcement and the legal system approach and interact with victims. And forensic psychologists often work with victims, assessing the psychological impact of crimes, providing therapy, and offering expert testimony in court. So understanding the experiences and needs of victims is really essential for forensic psychologists. It allows them to provide better support, advocate for victims' rights, and contribute to a more just and effective criminal justice system. Now, when we classify victims, we think in terms of how close they are to the crime and how direct the impact is. So we can think in terms of primary victims, who are individuals who are directly harmed by the criminal act. So, for example, the person who is assaulted or robbed. And then there's the secondary victims, or those who are indirectly affected by the crime, such as family members, children of victims, or friends of victims of the primary victim. And the secondary victims can also include witnesses to the crime. And then there are tertiary victims, the whole broader community, the broader society that suffers from the impact of a crime, such as fear of crime in the neighborhood after a series of burglaries. And there are common types of victimization. We can kind of organize them into different areas. So, like, for example, you can have the type of violent crime. That would be physical assaults, homicide, robbery, and domestic violence. And these crimes often involve direct harm to the victim's body and can lead to severe psychological consequences. There's sexual assault, which is a particularly traumatic form of victimization, and sexual assault includes rape, molestation, and other forms of sexual violence. And victims often experience long-term psychological effects such as PTSD, anxiety, and depression. There's domestic violence, and this type of victimization occurs within intimate or familial relationships and can involve physical, emotional, or psychological abuse. There's cybercrime. With the rise of technology, cybercrime has become a significant form of victimization. It includes identity theft, cyber stalking, online harassment, financial scams. And then there's property crime, burglary, theft, vandalism. These might not involve direct physical harm, but the loss of property and a sense of violation can have a lasting emotional effect upon the victims. So we also need to be concerned about and look at the patterns and trends of victimization. So we're concerned about things like age. Younger individuals are often at higher risk of certain types of victimization, such as violent crime and cyberbullying. Conversely, elderly individuals may be more vulnerable to financial scams and elder abuse. Gender plays a significant role in victimization patterns. For instance, women are more likely to be victims of sexual assault and domestic violence, while men are more frequently victims of violent crimes like assault and homicide. There's socioeconomic factors. People with lower socioeconomic backgrounds are at higher risk of victimization due to factors such as living in high crime areas, lack of access of resources, and reduced social support. And then there's racial and ethnic minorities may experience higher rates of certain types of victimization, such as hate crimes or racially motivated violence. And systemic issues like discrimination can also exacerbate their experiences. We also need to consider vulnerable populations. Young people are particularly vulnerable to victimization due to their dependence on adults and their lack of experience with recognizing danger. So they're at higher risk for abuse and neglect and exploitation. Members of the LGBTQ plus two-spirit community are at increased risk of hate crime or discrimination or violence, and they may also face secondary victimization when seeking help due to bias or lack of understanding from authorities. Individuals with physical, intellectual, or emotional disabilities are often targeted for victimization due to their perceived vulnerabilities. So there's a lot that we need to be mindful of. Now, the purpose of this part of the lecture, we're going to just transition a little bit to the impact of victimization, is to really understand the psychological effects that victimization can have on individuals. So when we think in terms of short-term psychological effects, things like shock and disbelief The immediate victimization leads to individuals often in this shock, this denial, this disbelief. And this is a natural response to trauma as the mind attempts to protect itself from overwhelming emotions. And within this, there's this acute stress reaction. Symptoms like heightened arousal, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, sleep disturbances. And victims may also experience physical symptoms like headaches, nausea, and fatigue. And this might also include person becoming hyper aware of their surroundings, having hypervigilance, fearing that the crime might happen again. And this heightened state of alertness can interfere with daily life and increase feelings of vulnerability. And then we move on to the long-term psychological effects. Development of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a common long-term effect of victimization. PTSD can develop weeks, months, or even years after the event. Symptoms include re-experiencing the trauma through flashbacks or nightmares, avoidance of reminders of the trauma, negative changes in mood and cognition, and hyperarousal. And victims may struggle with feelings of sadness and hopelessness and anxiety, and these emotions can persist long after the initial event and may interfere with their ability to function in daily life. And some victims, especially those who survived the event where others did not, like a mass shooting or natural disaster, may experience survivor guilt, and they may feel undeserving of survival or blame themselves for not preventing the event. And so to cope with all of these emotional issues of pain, some victims will turn to drugs or alcohol, leading to substance use issues. And this creates a cycle of self-destructive behavior that further complicates the recovery process. And trauma is deeply distressing and disturbing, and it overwhelms an individual, and it overwhelms their ability to cope, and it alters the way the victim perceives and interacts with the world off into the future. And we can kind of think of this as in terms of where the development of trauma really comes in, the long-term psychological consequences. Because there's different stages that a person will go through in trauma, and that's very important. There's the crisis phase, and this is the initial response to the trauma. It's characterized by shock and disorientation. But then there's the adjustment phase, where victims begin to process what happened and may seek out coping mechanisms. And at this stage, there's a lot of emotional turmoil. But ideally, we get to the reintegration phase, where the victim starts to reintegrate the trauma experience into their lives, finding a way to move forward. And this may involve finding meaning in the trauma or developing a new sense of normalcy. So there's a lot of factors involved in the recovery process, including how they move through each of these phases. Their own genetic makeup, their own personal resilience, the nature of the trauma, and the availability of supports for them. And so I want to really highlight here that social support is extremely important. Friends, family, community resources that can provide emotional support and comfort, practical assistance, and a sense of security are very important. But also having mental health professionals that are able and experienced in dealing with trauma are very important. Cognitive behavioral therapy to help the person reframe negative thoughts and develop healthier coping mechanisms. remember that every time you take a memory out and use it and play with it, you are reinforcing and changing that memory. So if you do this in a strategic way, you can minimize the harm of the trauma. And that's what CBT tries to do. There's also trauma focus therapy. Another thing that ties in with that is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which also tries to change the nature of the memory and where the memory is stored. Group therapy can also be a place where you can be safe and kind of start to normalize the feelings that you have and share your experiences with others and foster a sense of community and understanding. And all of this ties into the ideas of resilience. You'll always want to build resilience into people. Resilience is that ability to bounce back from adversity. And not all victims develop long-term psychological issues. Many show remarkable resilience. Factors that contribute to resilience include things like a positive self-concept, strong social supports, and effective coping strategies. But forensic psychologists assess the psychological impact of victimization, provide therapeutic interventions, and may serve as expert witnesses in this process. Now, victimology, how do we use that within the criminal justice system? Well, let's put this into context here, first off, because traditionally, criminal justice has been focused upon the offender with very little attention given to the rights and needs of the victim. The victim is really kind of marginalized traditionally and limited involvement in the legal process. But in response to this marginalization, the victim rights movement began to emerge in the 1970s, where it really advocated for greater recognition and protection of victims within the legal system. And this movement led to significant changes in legislation and policy. So today, many jurisdictions recognize the rights of victims, which may include the right to be informed of court proceedings, the right to protection from the accused, the right to restitution, and the right to be heard during sentencing and parole hearings. And part of this includes the victim impact statement, which allows victims to express the emotional, physical, and financial impact of the crime on their lives. And the victim impact statement really provides victims with a voice. There are debates about the influencing that it has upon sentencing, where critics will argue that it may lead to inconsistent sentencing, while supporters believe that it's an essential part for a fair and just process. So preparing and delivering a victim impact statement we need to recognize, a very daunting experience for the victims. They might face emotional distress, fear, retaliation, and uncertainty about the legal process. And there are some high-profile cases where, most recently from Idaho, where there were victim impact statements that were very powerful, not coming from the primary victims who died, but from the family. There's also within victimology the idea of restorative justice. Restorative justice is that approach that focuses on repairing the harm caused by crime. Ideally through reconciliation between the victim and the offender. And the emphasis here is upon healing for the victim, accountability for the offender, and community involvement in the process. So restorative justice is something that involves the victim-offender mediation, where victims have the opportunity to communicate directly to the offender. And this process can be empowering to victims, allowing them to express their feelings and seek answers. And restorative justice can then lead, ideally, to positive outcomes, like reduced recidivism and increased victim satisfaction. However, we need to be mindful that it may not be suitable for all types of crime, for particularly those involving severe violence or power imbalances between the victim and the offender. And we also need to recognize that victims face some challenges within the criminal justice system, because victims experience additional trauma when they're expected to go through their interactions with the criminal justice system, particularly when the questioning is insensitive, where there are long delays in the legal process, or a lack of understanding of legal professionals. And some victims, particularly those from marginalized communities, may face barriers to accessing justice. These barriers can include language differences, distrust of law enforcement, and limited resources. And the criminal justice system always needs to balance the rights of victims with those of the defendants. And this can lead to some tensions, particularly in cases where victims seek harsher penalties or where the defendant's rights to a fair trial must be protected. So in the midst of all of this, there are a lot of things that we need to think about as we strive to further develop victimology and better incorporate it into the criminal justice system. How can we train people to be better informed of trauma, of restorative justice, of being an advocate for victims' rights? All needs to be part of this process. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and talk about rape and sexual assault and post-traumatic stress prevention and management. Now, this doesn't necessarily, a lot of this, particularly the PTSD part, isn't specific to rape and sexual assault, but I do want to kind of highlight the different parts here. So, rape traditionally has been considered sexual intercourse that is performed without consent and done mainly by force or deception. So rape is most often motivated by extreme anger toward the victim or a need to overpower the victim. It's a act of power more often than it is an act of desire. And the motive is rarely sexual, and violence is not always involved. Forced sex is intended to abuse, to humiliate, to dehumanize the victim, and this has some profound psychological and physical effects upon the person. And rape is often defined as penetration of the vagina by the penis or penetration of the buttocks. Other forms of rape can be performed through additional objects, such as a hand or finger or an object. And some other sexual injustices have been expanded into the definition of rape. But there are many different types of rape. There's acquaintance rape. There is date rape, there's statutory rape, there is spousal rape, there's incestual rape, there's rape in war and political conflict, and there's rape within the military. So there's many different types that we need to be mindful of. And the statistics are that every 2.5 minutes somewhere in America, someone is sexually assaulted, and these are reported rapes. And 1 in 6 American women are victims of sexual assault, and 1 in 33 men are. And in the early 2000s, there was an average of around 200,000 victims of rape, attempted rape or sexual assault. And about 40% 4% of these were rape victims under the age of 18 and 80% under the age of 30. But since 1993, rape and sexual assault has fallen over time. It's fallen about 70%. So I want to just take a little bit of time now and just kind of go through the process of what someone might go through with a rape kit. If they were to come in and be seeking help for a rape, they might be taken to a hospital, in which case they would the hospital would have a standardized kit that they would use, and a doctor or a medical professional and a member of the police force would be present, and they would follow this very standardized procedure for moving through the process. And you can kind of see here the different parts to the rape kit. Everything would be labeled. There would be bags. The patient would be expected to take off all their clothes and everything to be bagged. Noting anything that's stained by the perpetrator's fluids. The patient's underwear would be placed in a bag and sealed with tape. There'd be saliva samples taken. There'd be oral specimens obtained. There would be any semen, blood, or saliva stains would be taken. There would be rectal specimens for semen or whatever else. Collection of pubic hairs in order to kind of differentiate the hairs of the victim and the perpetrator. And this kind of varies a little bit depending upon, there'd also be genital specimens taken, and just a lot of things that has to be gone through in this process. And that obviously is going to be very traumatic. And all of this is done in the sight of the police officer and the doctor, and that itself is going to be traumatic. So you can just see there that there's a lot that goes on, and then statements are going to be taken. There's going to be a checklist, a history, history of the assault, history, the victim's history is going to be taken. There's going to be examination findings. And this leads to some of that work of Joseph Zohar that we talked about at the beginning of the class. Now, according to Zohar, if you minimize the trauma, that is, if you minimize the importance of the trauma and you yourself are calm, that helps the person to minimize it for themselves. Now, to be clear, this does not help in the collection of information, but it helps the victim in recover themselves psychologically. So if you minimize the trauma and get the person back to a normal routine within the first 6 to 8 hours of the trauma, then you cut the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder in half. Very important, because the long-term, lifelong effects of PTSD certainly outweigh a lot of other things. However, in the case of rape, we ask a lot of questions. We collect a lot of data, which is all counter to the care of the psychological care of the client. So here's some suggestions for psychological care to prevent PTSD that I would like to recommend. Don't let them fall asleep, because memories get consolidated in sleep. So for at least, don't let them not until they go back to a routine more than 8 hours out from the trauma. So, if it's 3 hours after the trauma, insist that they stay awake and try to follow some kind of routine. And what that does is it fills up your emotional memories with other things other than the trauma and prevents it from being consolidated. And this then helps to avoid the trauma being put into a place that we don't want it in the mind of the person. And this can be applied to rape, but it can also be applied to like a car accident or witnessing the death of somebody. And in simply doing those things, you are cutting the incidence of PTSD in half. Now, when we are thinking in terms of later times with dealing with trauma, beyond that initial breaking, so if the person is still recovering, but you've done that first thing, then some other things that you want to do are to dealing with stuck feelings with faulty, extreme thinking. Help the person deal with trust. Help them to find a balance and power and control. Help them to find their own self-esteem and move back into intimacy relationships in a healthy way. And so there's also a lot of other kinds of things that can be done. As I already mentioned before, the systematic desensitization and reprocessing, eye movement desensitization, cognitive behavioral therapy, relaxation techniques, group therapy, all of which is extremely important within this process. Now, I want to just highlight a little bit of what victimology might look like in certain cases. Now, one of those cases would be an individual by the name of Shanda Sher in 1992 in Madison, Indiana. She was brutally murdered. And her body was found burned beyond recognition near a remote road. And the case quickly gathered national attention because of the brutality of the fact that the killers were who they were. So a little bit of the victimology details. Shanda was 12 years old, middle school student, friendly, a little bit naive, but she'd recently become involved with some fellow students. And some of the students, they had a bit of a relationship, and one of the students was jealous of the interactions of some of the others. And so as a young adolescent girls, the girls, they were at a vulnerable age. They were emotionally developing and possibly unaware of the true extent of the dangers within their social circle. And her friends, one of whom was jealous of this relationship, hatched an idea that they would lure Shanda out under the pretense of simply going out on a friendly outing. And they brought some other friends along to a location where they tortured her, beat her, and ultimately set her on fire. So in this case, it was friends. And so it's important to understand victimology here in order to be able to figure out what happened. Because on the face of it, you would not expect it to be other middle school girls doing this. But it turns out that the killers were a group of 4 teenage girls. And when we use victimology, we can piece together all of the key elements, such as the victim's vulnerability, the social dynamics that are at play, and the emotional motives, such as jealousy and revenge behind the crime. And in doing so, they can identify how these factors pointed towards the involvement of someone close to the victim's social circle, ultimately leading to the revelation of these girls perpetrating the crime. So, the question that I ask, that I want to ask here today is, how do we help protect someone against PTSD, a victim against PTSD? And one of the basic things that we can do, keep them awake. Simply keep them awake, help them get back to some kind of normal routine in those first 8 hours after the crime. And the less you talk about the trauma and the more sleep is disrupted in the hours after the trauma, the less likely that PTSD is going to form. And that becomes a very valuable thing that research into victimology helps us to understand. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.